Now I said that a lot of the shamanic initiatory rituals seem to be associated with the use of hallucinogenic drugs. And so the most common ones that we know about are mushrooms. So, for example, there's this mushroom, which many of you have probably seen in fairy tales, right? That's on the cover of fairy tales very frequently. And that's called an Amanita muscaria mushroom. And it's generally viewed as extremely toxic. And there's some reason for that, because it can make the people who eat it very sick. And now and then people do die from it. But mostly it's extraordinarily hallucinogenic. The Vikings, for example, this is quite a terrifying story. The Vikings used to take Amanita muscaria mushrooms before they went on their pillaging trips. And they used the mushrooms to transform themselves into the equivalent of predatory monsters. So they usually, their sort of target was wolves or bears. And the word berserk, which is what the Vikings used to go, meant bear shirt. And so they would train their young men to eat these hallucinogenic mushrooms and turn themselves into pain-free predators. And then they would take them before they went on a pillaging raid. And so you just imagine, you know, you're sitting there in northern England and you're in your village and it's all peaceful and these bloody crazy Vikings come out of the ocean in the boats, you know, the open boats that they've traveled across the North Sea in, and they're all like stoned out of their gourd on Amanita muscaria mushrooms and all convinced that they're like predatory bears, and that's exactly how they're acting, and they have no pain whatsoever. And it's like, that's not a good scene. That's not a good scene, you know, and the Vikings come through and they just destroy everything. It's like, so they were used for martial purposes by the Vikings. But they're a drug that's used very commonly by people who are inducing shamanic experiences among themselves across the whole northern part of Europe and Asia. And they grow almost everywhere. So those are the original magic mushroom, you know, the magic red mushroom with the white dots. And if you look in, you can see these things in drawings everywhere, especially in fairy tales. Very common representation in fairy tales. There is some evidence that religions that are, I suppose, in some ways more articulated and sort of sophisticated, in that they're more articulated, like Christianity, say, compared to the more shamanic religions, also have their roots in hallucinogenic experience. And this may be true to a degree that we really don't understand. So, for example, this is taken from the Eadwine manuscript, which is 11th century, fundamentally, 11th to 13th century, because there were copies of it made at different times. What you see here, it's mind-boggling, really, is that the tree that the snake is associated with is a psilocybin mushroom, and that's a very characteristic representation of a psilocybin mushroom. And the fruit that Eve is feeding to Adam is part of the psilocybin mushroom. And there is speculation, you know, among people who are sort of at the fringes of evolutionary theory that part of the way that human beings levered themselves up into increased consciousness was by the use of mushrooms. And you can see in the representations over there, some of them are absolutely remarkable, like the one on the top right-hand corner there, that's Christ, and he's standing there like this with his hands up, and then underneath the bottom half of that circle is a psilocybin mushroom, with the head is in like the main body of the mushroom is in the same position as Christ's head, and the offshoots of the mushroom are in the same position as his hands. So, well, God only knows what that means. So that's very strange and a remarkable thing, and we really don't know what to make of it. And there's a lot more investigation to be done on that. This is an ayahuasca vine, and it's part of what the Amazonian shamans used to brew their hallucinogenic mixtures. And no, none of the Westerners who've gone to study the Amazonian shaman can figure out how the hell they determined how they were going to make their mixture, because it's virtually impossible to make. You need to take the vine, and then you need to take another plant that doesn't grow in the same place. And you have to mix them together in the right proportions, and then you have to cook them together for 72 hours, and you have to do that without breathing in any of the vapors. And, you know, there's thousands and thousands of different kinds of plants in the Amazonian jungle, and it isn't obvious in any way how the people who are using these mixtures figured out how to make them. And if you ask them, they say, well, the plants told us how to do it. And, you know, that for modern Western people, that's not much of an explanation, but it's certainly the explanation that the tribesmen seem to stick to. And, you know, God only knows how people gather their information. You know, chimpanzees use medicinal plants. You know, they're capable of finding plants in their habitat, they can eat that are emetic or so on, that help them deal with diseases. And it's not clear at all how they figured that out. So there's lots of mysteries about the origin of human knowledge, that's for sure. So there are 3 sources of potential visionary experience, and this is very interesting. So here's the biochemical construction of hallucinogenic chemicals. So the first thing you see on the bottom right is a serotonin molecule. Now serotonin is, in some ways, it's the major brain neurotransmitter. And the reason I say that is because during your embryological development, your brain grows out, you know, it sort of flowers forth, and it's guided in its development by the serotonin system, the system that uses serotonin as its primary neurochemical transmitter. So it's not only in our very archaic system, and it's so old that you share it, as I've mentioned before, with crustaceans, but it's also the system that sort of puts you together as you emerge out of nothing. And so you see its peculiar chemical structure there, and then you see these are all different hallucinogenic substances. This one is psilocybin, for example, and they're all, and DMT is a very weird chemical. It's very illegal, DMT. It produces, it's part of ayahuasca, although ayahuasca is made with a plant that contains DMT, and then something called an MAO inhibitor, which decreases the rate at which your body breaks it down. But pure DMT produces an instantaneous 10-minute hallucinogenic high that where people constantly report contact with aliens. And there's a psychiatrist who spent years documenting DMT experiences, and every single person he walked through the experience with reported the same thing. They're shot out of their body, they're immediately in an alien landscape. So, well, you know, what that seems to indicate is that, you know, from a more purely rational perspective, is that these chemicals produce characteristic experiences that are associated with visionary experience. They put you in something that's like a dream state. Now, oddly, the dream state seems to be somewhat similar from person to person, but there are ways that, in some sense, that the contents of the unconscious mind can be made manifest to the conscious mind, at least for brief periods of time. Sometimes that can be clearly horrifying, because sometimes people take these chemicals and have like the worst experience of their life. And part of that seems to be associated with the sort of thing that might happen to you in psychotherapy. So, for example, if you were convinced that your psyche wasn't very well ordered and you were harboring sort of dark secrets and lies and all the sorts of things that might complicate your life, and all sorts of familial pathology and, you know, cultural baggage and like the horrors that sort of live inside your brain. You know, in psychotherapy, you would sort of confront those one by one. In a hallucinogenic experience, you might confront all of those at the same time. You know, and for many people, that's exactly equivalent to a quick trip to hell, and it's not something they'd rather repeat. So, now why things are set up that way? Well, who knows? You know, I mean, we don't really understand these things. We don't understand the relationship between the parts of the brain that are articulated and conscious, and then the lower parts that are sort of the repositories of traumatic information. And there's deeper mysteries that we don't understand too. So it turns out, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term epigenesis, but there are studies of epigenetics now that show that there are certain experiences that alter your genetic structure. And well, we know that partly because if you put yourself in a new situation, a radically new situation, new genes will turn on inside of you, and they'll code for new proteins, and they'll build new structures for you. So new neurological structures sometimes, and that's part of how you can adapt. And it's also part of the reason why banging yourself against various obstacles, you know, in a kind of systematic way, is a good way of expanding your range of capabilities. So we know that experience can turn new genetic processes on that are sort of latent prior to that. But what we didn't know was that some of those experiences transform your genetic structures in a way that you can transmit to your children. So, and that, you know, that's Lamarckian evolution. No one ever hypothesized that that was possible. But you can look it up. It's mainstream science now, although, you know, people are still not really sure what to do about it, how to think about it from a conceptual perspective, because that sort of thing wasn't supposed to be possible. So, you know, so we have no idea to what level of being your experiences can be encoded. And we really don't know how you encode experience anyways. We don't know what the fundamental structures of your memory are, how that's associated with your conceptions of time and space, and how that's related to your ongoing experience. Like, those things are deeply mysterious to us. And what happens, at least in part with the hallucinogens, is that they seem to take all the horrors and terrors that you haven't dealt with and just put them in your face now. And that's part of the shamanic experience. And so it's not something for people to take lightly. And, and generally, people don't. So, but I've often found that it was very strange that these chemicals produce experiences that are so strange that our culture instantly deemed them illegal. For me, it's like looking at what happened back in the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church went after Galileo because he had something, strange to say about the moon. It's like these experiences have tapped into something that's a very, very primordial element of human existence and associated, say, with these shamanic rituals that have been going on for tens of thousands of years and that human cultures have always used to orient themselves. And they're so there's so much anathema to our current culture that we punish people severely for experimenting with them. It's very, very peculiar behavior. So, although there's no doubt that this sort of thing is dangerous and very peculiar, but